What if your mother, someone who had known you longer than anyone else, who had watched you grow, held your secrets, and shared your joys, left behind a secret that would change everything you thought you knew about your family? What if that secret wasn't just about something hidden in the past, something that might have faded with time, but something so profound, so life-altering, that it would reshape the very fabric of your relationships? Something so deep, it might even make you question who you thought you were and how you fit into the world. The letter she left behind was more than just a goodbye. It wasn't a simple final message of love or a well-worn piece of advice she thought was important enough to pass down. No, this letter was a revelation. It was a twist of fate, something none of them could have seen coming, and something no one could have prepared for. As the family gathered, they had no idea what they were about to uncover. They thought they knew their mother's life. After all, she was their mother. She had been there for every milestone, every tear, every moment of joy. But sometimes, the people we love hold the deepest secrets, and sometimes those secrets are the very things that bind us all together in ways we never imagined. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? How will it change the way they see each other? How will it force them to confront the past they've buried, the regrets they've pushed aside, and the relationships they've neglected? Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't just take away, it opens doors. And in this case, it opened a door to a past full of untold stories, broken promises, and hidden pain. What lies behind that door is something none of them were ready for. The question is, will they be able to handle what they find? Stick around and make sure to hit the subscribe button too, because this is not just a story about loss, it's a story about what happens when the people you love, and the secrets they keep, are finally brought into the light. And in the end, will they be able to put the pieces together? Or will the truth tear them apart? This is the story of how one mother's last wish unraveled the world she tried to protect, and left her family forever changed. In the dimly lit living room of the house that once felt like home, there was an undeniable stillness in the air, the kind of quiet that stretches across every inch of space, filling the corners with unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and years of silence. The house hadn't changed much over the years. The wallpaper, though slightly faded, still held the memories of laughter and love that once filled its rooms. But now it felt like a shell, a hollow reminder of what used to be. And in that shell, after Sarah's funeral, the family had gathered. Her legacy now something they were all forced to confront, each of them carrying their own burdens, their own broken pieces of the past. Let me introduce you to Sarah's family, the people who will be forced to look at each other through new eyes, as they dig into the secrets their mother had carefully tucked away in her final days. First, there's Sarah, the matriarch. She had been the quiet force behind the family, the one who held everything together with her nurturing hands and the strength of 1,000 unspoken words. For years, she had been the glue that held this fractured family in place. But now she was gone, and with her passing, her family was left to sift through the remnants of her life. What they would find, no one was prepared for. But Sarah had always been a woman of deep mystery, a woman who had learned to hide her pain behind a smile, behind the guise of a loving mother. Those who had loved her, and even those who had lost touch with her, had no idea just how much of her life had been kept behind closed doors. Not until now. Next, there's Jessica, the eldest daughter. She had always been the strong one, the one who put on a brave face and took charge when the world seemed to be falling apart. But behind that mask of strength, there was a storm. You see, Jessica had never truly dealt with the wounds of her past. She was filled with unresolved anger, a bitterness that had been building for years. She had felt abandoned, neglected in a way that no child should ever feel. And though she had always been the responsible one, the one who took care of everything, Jessica had always believed that her mother had favored her siblings more, that she was expected to be the one to hold everything together, and that no one had ever seen the cracks in her own heart. She felt like the forgotten one. And after Sarah's passing, that sense of abandonment only seemed to grow. It was a wound that had never fully healed. And now, Jessica was about to confront the truths she had been running from. Then there was David, the youngest son. Unlike Jessica, David had always been more of a wanderer, a dreamer who never quite fit into the expectations placed on him by his family. He had always felt disconnected from the rest of them, like he was living a separate life, looking in on their world but never quite belonging. David had spent much of his life searching for meaning, trying to understand who he was and where he fit in. He had grown up in the shadows of his older sibling, often overlooked and forgotten in the chaos of family life. And yet, beneath the surface, David had always known that there was something more, that his mother, Sarah, had carried a heavy burden that he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't until her death, and the letters she left behind, that he would begin to unravel the secrets that had kept him emotionally distant from his family for so long. David's journey was one of self-discovery, and in the process, he would uncover more than he had ever imagined about his own past. And then there was Tom, the estranged husband, the father who had been absent for far too many years. Tom had not spoken to Sarah in ages. Their relationship had been strained, worn thin by years of bitterness, resentment, and unresolved pain. They hadn't spoken in so long that it almost felt like they were strangers. Tom had walked away from their marriage, leaving Sarah to bear the weight of their family on her shoulders. He had built a life far from the woman he once loved, and now, with her passing, he was forced to confront everything he had tried to bury for years. But what was buried had a way of resurfacing. And as Tom stood in that house, surrounded by the remnants of a life he had abandoned, he would have to reckon with his decisions. Decisions that had led him to this moment, and decisions that might not be as simple as he once thought. The letters would force him to see his past in a new light, and maybe, just maybe, he would be able to repair the broken bonds of his family, or lose them forever. The atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. The air felt heavy with years of silence, as each family member sat in their own world, lost in their thoughts. The house, once full of warmth and laughter, now felt cold and distant. The walls that had witnessed their best and worst moments seemed to echo with the ghosts of their former selves. It was in this silence that the letters would break through, forcing each of them to confront not just the mother they had lost, but the people they had become. This is the beginning of their journey, one that will force them to face the things they've been running from, the things they've hidden deep within their hearts. And in the end, they will learn that sometimes it's the secrets we keep that shape us the most, whether we realize it or not. In the days that followed Sarah's funeral, the family was left to pick up the pieces, to try and make sense of the empty space she had left behind. But there was something else waiting for them, something that would force them all to confront their pasts, their grief, and the emotions they had been running from for so long. It started with the letters. Before her death, Sarah had written one for each of them, a final gift, perhaps, or maybe a final reckoning. Each letter was carefully sealed, addressed to the person it was meant for, and each one was to be opened only after her passing. Her instructions were clear. No one was to read their letter until the right moment, and now, with her gone, that moment had arrived. The first letter was addressed to Jessica, who hadn't expected this. She had assumed that her mother's death would bring closure, a sense of peace after years of frustration and bitterness. But as she took the letter from the table and held it in her hands, something inside her clenched. The weight of it felt heavier than just paper and ink. It felt like a challenge, a summons to face something she had been avoiding. Jessica had always felt like the responsible one, the one who had to step up when things went wrong, the one who had to keep the family from falling apart. But despite her best efforts, there were cracks in the foundation, cracks that her mother had never fully acknowledged. Sarah had always kept things from her, hidden parts of herself, and Jessica had never understood why. Why hadn't her mother been honest with her about the things that mattered most? Why hadn't Sarah shared the truth about their family's history, about the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept? Was it because Jessica wasn't strong enough to handle it? Or was it simply that Sarah never trusted her with the truth? Now, with the letter in her hands, Jessica was faced with a dilemma. Did she dare open it and face the truth that had been hidden from her for so long? Or would she put it aside, unwilling to confront the emotions she had buried for so many years? What if the letter revealed things she wasn't ready to hear? Things that could shatter the already fragile relationship she had with her mother's memory? As she sat down on the couch, staring at the envelope, Jessica could feel the anger and betrayal rising up in her chest. How many times had she tried to reach out to her mother, only to be met with silence? How many times had she felt like the forgotten child, left to deal with the fallout of decisions made long before she was even born? And now, after all these years, here was a letter that was supposed to give her answers. But did she even want the answers? David, the youngest son, was sitting across from Jessica, his eyes on the floor. He had always been the quiet one, the one who kept to himself, who never really fit in with the rest of the family. And now, as the letters were passed around, David felt a strange mix of confusion and skepticism. He had never been as close to his mother as Jessica had been. He had always been distant, disconnected from the emotional turmoil that had defined their family life. For David, life had always been a series of moments he just had to get through. But now, with these letters, everything was being turned upside down. David wasn't sure what to believe. He had never understood why his mother had kept so many things from him, why there had always been an emotional distance between them. Was the letter just another attempt to repair the damage done over the years? A last-ditch effort to make amends for a lifetime of neglect? Or was there something more to it? Something deeper? Something he wasn't ready to face? David's mind raced as he stared at the envelope in his hands. He had never been one to go into the past. He preferred to keep moving forward, to ignore the things that made him uncomfortable. But as his fingers traced the edges of the paper, he couldn't help but wonder if the letter held a key to understanding his mother, to understanding the family he had always felt so apart from. Still, he was skeptical. He didn't want to open it and be hit with a wave of emotions that he wasn't prepared for. What if it only made things worse? Across the room, Tom sat in a chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. The letters had been placed before him, waiting for him to open them, but he hadn't moved. He refused to. Tom was the last person anyone expected to find in the living room of this house, after years of being absent. He had walked away from Sarah, from the family, and now, standing here in this room, he felt like a stranger. The years of bitterness and resentment had built up so much between him and his family that the idea of reading a letter from Sarah felt impossible. How could he face the woman who had once been his wife? The woman he had abandoned so many years ago? Tom's refusal to open the letter wasn't just about avoiding the past. It was about the pain, the regret, and the anger he had carried with him since the day he left. It wasn't easy to confront the wreckage of his own choices, the things he had done to this family, to Sarah. He had spent so long trying to forget, trying to bury the past, that the idea of facing it now felt like an unbearable weight. What if the letter contained a final judgment? What if it forced him to see his mistakes, his failures, in a way that he couldn't escape? The conflict wasn't just about opening the letters. It was about confronting the unresolved feelings, the feelings of abandonment, guilt, anger, and regret that each of them carried. Each family member had their own baggage, their own reasons for not wanting to face the truth. Jessica, with her years of feeling ignored and unloved. David, with his confusion and emotional detachment. Tom, with his bitterness and shame. And all of them had their own reasons for not wanting to face the past, because doing so would mean confronting the wounds they had kept hidden for far too long. As the silence stretched on, the tension in the room became palpable. No one was ready to open the letters. No one was ready to deal with the emotions that would come flooding in once the truth was revealed. But deep down, they all knew that there was no turning back. Sarah's letter had forced their hand. The truth would come out whether they were ready or not. And so, the family sat there, each of them holding their own letter, each of them trapped in their own emotional turmoil. The past was no longer something they could ignore. The unresolved conflicts, the things they had all been avoiding, were now in their faces, demanding to be dealt with. The question was no longer whether they would open the letters, it was how they would handle the storm that would come when they did. The silence in the room hung heavily, thick with anticipation, as one by one, the family members began to open their letters. No one spoke, no one moved. Each of them was caught in a private storm, bracing themselves for the truths they knew they would soon have to face. But none of them expected what came next. Jessica was the first to break the silence. She ripped open the envelope with shaky hands, her pulse quickening as the paper crinkled under her fingers. Her eyes scanned the letter quickly, but as the words began to sink in, her face drained of color. She stopped reading, staring at the page for what felt like an eternity, her mind struggling to process what her mother had written. The letter revealed a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that Jessica never could have imagined. It wasn't just about her mother's past, it was about her father. Sarah, it turned out, had always known about Tom's sexual affair with other women long before she even confronted him. She had also known about the betrayal that Jessica had grown up believing was hidden from her. The truth was, Sarah had kept that knowledge locked away, choosing to protect her family from the pain of it by not talking about it. She hadn't told Jessica, hadn't shared the truth about why things between her and Tom had soured. To Jessica, this revelation felt like a crushing blow. For as long as she could remember, Jessica had always struggled to understand the disconnect between her parents. She had grown up in a home that felt fractured, where love was spoken in fragmented sentences, where arguments were quiet but palpable. She had blamed her father's absence for the tension in their family, never truly understanding why her mother seemed so emotionally distant. And now, as she read the letter, everything started to click. Sarah had known, and she had never told her. In a twisted way, Jessica had spent her entire life unaware of the very reason she felt abandoned by both of her parents. But her mother had kept the truth hidden, hoping it would protect her, hoping that Jessica could live in blissful ignorance. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily in Jessica's chest, threatening to collapse her. The question that plagued her was no longer just about her father's betrayal. It was about her mother's choices. Why had Sarah kept this from her? Had she never trusted Jessica enough to share it? Or was it an act of love, an attempt to shield her from a wound that couldn't heal? Jessica's heart raced as she realized that the foundation of everything she had known about love and family was built on a lie. Her hand shook as she held the letter, but the words blurred before her eyes. The room around her seemed to spin, and for a moment, she felt utterly alone, as if the entire weight of the world had been placed on her shoulders. Her feelings of betrayal only deepened as she realized that her mother, whom she had always believed had the answers, had been carrying this burden alone, never once letting on that she knew the truth. David sat quietly, his eyes scanning the letter that had been placed in front of him. He had been trying to avoid the drama, trying to keep himself emotionally detached from the chaos around him. But as he read the words, his body tensed, his breath catching in his throat. Sarah had written about her struggles, about the sacrifices she had made for him over the years, and how she had to undergo the painful procedure of bone marrow extraction to provide life-saving stem cells for him when he had leukemia at a very young age. And there it was, right in front of him. An admission that his mother had put everything on the line to protect him, to shield him from a harsh reality he hadn't known existed. Sarah had given up so much for him, sacrificing financial stability, her own happiness, and the dreams she had once held dear. She had done everything to keep their family afloat, even when it meant living in ways David couldn't have imagined. And as he read about the financial struggles, the quiet sacrifices, the countless hours Sarah had worked just to ensure he had what he needed, David's heart began to ache with regret. All his life, David had felt that emotional distance between him and his mother. He had always felt that she didn't understand him, that she didn't know the pain he carried. But now, as the truth unraveled in front of him, David realized that it wasn't that she didn't care. She had been fighting battles of her own, and in trying to protect him, she had kept him at arm's length, unwilling to let him see the harsh realities she faced. But the sacrifices she made, sacrifices that had never been acknowledged, had taken their toll on her. David's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the letter, the guilt gnawing at him. All the anger he had felt towards his mother for not being there, for not understanding, seemed so trivial now. He had never known the depth of her pain, the weight she had carried in silence. Tom sat at the far side of the room, his letter unopened, his posture stiff with defiance. He hadn't moved an inch since the letters were first handed out, still sitting in his chair, staring blankly ahead. He wasn't ready to read the letter, not yet. The anger he felt towards Sarah was still too raw, still too fresh in his heart. He had walked away from her years ago, and even though she was gone, the wounds of their past still festered. Tom's hand hovered over the envelope, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. He knew deep down that Sarah's words would only dredge up painful memories, memories he had spent years trying to forget. He wasn't ready to face the woman he had abandoned, the woman he had once promised to love and protect. Instead, he focused on his resentment, clinging to it as a shield. If he opened that letter, it would mean acknowledging everything he had run from, everything that had led him to leave his family and the woman he had once loved. The coldness in Tom's refusal to engage only deepened the rift between him and his children. Jessica had already been on edge, her emotions unraveling with each word of the letter she had just read. David, too, was visibly shaken, caught between the anger of his past and the sorrow of the truth. Tom's rejection of the letter was like a punch in the gut for both of them, a reminder of the years of abandonment, of the father who had never truly been there for them when they needed him most. And then, like a dam breaking, the tension in the room finally exploded. Jessica, unable to contain her emotions any longer, slammed her letter down onto the table. Her voice cracked as she shouted at her father, accusing him of destroying their family, of never being there when it mattered most. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom? Why did you hide this from me?" she screamed, the tears streaming down her face. "All these years, I've been blaming myself, thinking it was my fault, that I wasn't enough. But you—" David, his own emotions spilling over, stood up abruptly. "Don't you see? It wasn't just Mom. She was trying to protect us, me, from the truth. She did everything for us, and we just ignored it. We thought we were the ones suffering, but we had no idea what she went through." The argument swelled, as the words they had been holding back for so long came rushing to the surface. Every painful memory, every unresolved issue, came pouring out all at once. They yelled, they cried, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were all drowning in their own sorrow, their own regret. Tom sat there, still, refusing to speak, his heart hardening with every word that was thrown his way. But the more he sat in silence, the deeper the divide became, and the further they all seemed to drift from the family they had once known. The rising tension in the room was impossible to ignore. The emotional stakes were higher than ever. No one was ready to face the truth, and yet, no one could escape it. The cracks in their relationships were too wide to ignore now. As each letter peeled back a layer of their family's past, the stakes grew higher. Would they ever find their way back to each other? Or had the damage already been done? The tension in the room, thick with emotions, had finally reached its peak. The air felt charged, as if every word spoken, every accusation, every revelation had somehow led them to this point. This moment where everything would shift. Jessica, David, and Tom, all locked in their own struggles, sat in silence, their minds racing with the truths they had uncovered in the letters. But there was one final letter, one that would pull the threads together, forcing them all to look beyond the surface and face the most unexpected truth of all. This letter wasn't just for one person. It was for all of them. And as Jessica picked it up, her hands trembling, she knew this would be the letter that changed everything. She slowly tore open the envelope, the sound of paper tearing filling the room. Her heart hammered in her chest as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting, still familiar, seemed to carry a weight far beyond anything she could have anticipated. The words, as they slowly unfolded before her, seemed to echo with a finality that left no room for argument. The letter began simply enough, Sarah's familiar tone, her voice from beyond the grave. But the message that followed was something no one in the room had prepared for. Sarah wrote about a secret tragedy, a deep betrayal that had occurred years ago, something so powerful, so painful, that it had remained buried for far too long. Jessica's eyes widened as she read the next line. Sarah had known. She had known about the betrayal that none of them knew about. A betrayal that had torn their family apart long before any of them had understood what had really happened. Sarah had hidden this truth, believing it was too dangerous to expose, too painful to share. It was a wound so deep, it would have shattered everything they thought they knew about themselves. "I know this will be hard for you to understand," the letter continued. "But there was a time long before I met Tom, when I had a life of my own, a life I kept from all of you. There was someone I loved, someone I trusted completely. But that love, that trust, was broken in the worst possible way. And because of that, I made the decision to keep my past hidden from all of you, to protect you from the truth. But now, as I write this, I realize that I kept the truth from you because I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean for our family, for the life we built together. The truth was, Sarah had been carrying this secret for years. Before Tom, before the children, she had loved someone else. And that love, that relationship, had ended in betrayal. A betrayal so profound, it had shattered her completely. She had never told Tom. She had never told anyone, not even her children. And as time passed, Sarah had buried that part of herself, deciding that the past was something she needed to leave behind to move forward with her family. But now, in the wake of her death, it was time for the truth to come out. The room was still. No one spoke as Jessica finished reading. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Tom, who had been silently watching, looked away, his face pale. He had never known this about Sarah. He had never suspected that she, too, had carried such a burden of secrecy. For so long, he had held onto his own guilt, his own pain. And now, with this revelation, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The anger he had felt towards Sarah, the resentment that had kept him distant, suddenly seemed small. Here was a woman, a mother, who had suffered in silence for years. Here was a woman who had made choices not for herself, but for the sake of her family. How could he have known? How could he have ever understood the weight she carried? David sat frozen, his mind reeling. The letter wasn't just about Sarah's past. It was also about him. In the last paragraph, Sarah had written something that made his breath catch in his throat. She had known about his doubts, about his struggles, the sense of disconnection he had always felt. He had never felt truly at home in the family, and now, reading this letter, he realized why. Sarah had always known about his distance, his detachment. She had kept her distance, too, not because she didn't love him, but because she understood something he had never acknowledged. The weight of carrying the family together was too much for one person alone. David had always thought that his mother had failed him, that she had never seen his pain. But in truth, Sarah had been trying to protect him. She had known that his struggles were his to face, but she had also known that her own decisions had affected him in ways she couldn't change. She had made the choice to stay silent, to let him figure things out on his own, even if it meant keeping him at arm's length. It wasn't a rejection. It was an act of love, of trying to protect him from a world that she knew was far too harsh. As David absorbed the revelation, the truth began to settle over him like a heavy fog. He had always felt angry at his mother for not understanding him, for not being there when he needed her most. But now, looking at this letter, he understood. She had done what she thought was best for him. And in doing so, she had sacrificed a part of herself, a part of her happiness, in order to shield him from a world that had already taken so much from her. Jessica, too, felt a shift within her as she read the letter. She had spent so many years blaming her mother for everything, blaming her for the broken pieces of their family, for the way things had turned out. But as the truth began to sink in, Jessica realized that Sarah had been simply human. She had made choices, difficult choices, to protect them, to keep them safe from a past that was too painful to revisit. And in doing so, she had sacrificed her own happiness, her own peace of mind. The more Jessica thought about it, the more she understood why her mother had kept so many things hidden. Sarah hadn't been perfect, far from it. But in her own way, she had done everything she could to keep her children from the pain she had known. Jessica's anger began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of empathy, of understanding that she had never truly allowed herself to feel before. For the first time, she saw her mother not as a symbol of perfection, but as a person. Someone who had made mistakes, who had suffered, and who had loved in the best way she knew how. The room was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustle of the letter as Jessica let it fall from her hands. There was no more anger, no more shouting. The family was still, each of them processing the weight of the revelation in their own way. Tom, who had been silent throughout the reading of the letter, finally looked up. His eyes met Jessica's, then David's. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. They were no longer just a fractured family. They were a family that had been broken, yes, but also a family that had been deeply loved in a way they hadn't fully understood until now. The twist had come, not just in the form of the secrets Sarah had kept, but in the way those secrets had changed everything. They had forced the family to confront the truth about themselves and each other, to realize that love isn't always about perfect choices, but about the sacrifices made in the name of protection, in the name of family. And as the letter came to an end, one final line stood out. A plea from Sarah to her children and her husband. Please forgive me for not telling you sooner, but I did what I thought was best. I hope you can understand that. In that moment, the family knew that they would have to let go of the anger and the pain that had kept them apart. They would have to forgive Sarah, yes, but also each other. And in doing so, they would find a way to heal, to move forward, and to rebuild the family that had been fractured by secrets, by betrayal, and by time. The room was thick with tension as the final letter was read. Every word hung in the air like a cloud, suffocating, difficult to breathe through. There was no easy way to move past it, no way to step away from the overwhelming emotional weight that had settled between them. Sarah's secrets were now their secrets. The truth was exposed, and with it, everything they thought they knew about their family was thrown into chaos. For a moment, no one spoke. Jessica sat still, her fingers tightly clutching the edge of the letter. David, too, seemed paralyzed, as if trying to process everything that had just come to light. Tom, the father who had been absent for so long, looked as though he was trying to shrink into himself, avoiding the heat of the moment. But in the stillness, the silence only seemed to push them further apart. They had been handed the truth, but the question that now loomed over them all was whether they could face it, whether they could repair the damage, or whether the past would forever keep them trapped in its grip. Tom broke the silence first, but his words were hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether to face the truth head-on or continue hiding from it. He looked at Jessica and David, his voice low and strained. I don't know what to say. His words felt empty, as if there was no way to take back the years he had spent avoiding this moment. His eyes flicked between Jessica and David, who both seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. He didn't deserve their forgiveness, not after everything he had done. And yet, here they were, his children, still sitting with him in the same room. His emotions swirled inside him. Guilt, regret, anger at himself. He had never imagined that his actions, his absence, would create this kind of fracture in their lives. But the years had passed, and he couldn't undo them. All he could do now was try to make sense of the wreckage he had left behind. Asterisk. Tom took a deep breath. The internal struggle was evident on his face. Was he ready to let go of the resentment, the bitterness, the anger that had kept him from his family for so long? Could he look past the hurt and accept that his children had been carrying the weight of the world without him? The question seemed almost impossible to answer. He had tried to move on, to build a life apart from Sarah and the children. But now, after hearing the full truth of what Sarah had carried alone, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just Sarah he had abandoned. It was all of them. David, watching his father struggle, found his own emotions rising to the surface. He had spent so many years believing that he was the one who had been neglected, the one who had been overlooked. But now, hearing Tom's confession, hearing the raw honesty in his voice, David's heart softened. It was as if he had spent years being angry for the wrong reasons. His mother had hidden so much to protect him, and now, hearing about his father's pain, his father's regrets, it made him realize that they were all part of a much bigger story, a story none of them had ever been fully told. David looked at Tom, his voice quiet but firm. You don't get to walk away from this, Dad. Not again. His words hung heavy in the air. You want us to forgive you? You have to start by being here, by not running from this anymore. We can't fix what happened, but we can try to fix what's left. Tom's eyes welled with emotion, his chest tight. He had never been good at facing his emotions, and now, with David's words cutting through him like a knife, he realized just how much he had been avoiding. His whole life, it seemed, had been about running from responsibility, running from the family he had once promised to love and protect. And now, with everything out in the open, there was no more place to hide. Jessica, watching this interaction unfold before her, felt the surge of anger she had held inside for so long begin to shift. She had spent years resenting both her father and mother for their lack of honesty. She had carried the weight of that resentment with her, letting it shape every aspect of her relationship with them. But as she looked at Tom, and then at David, seeing their pain, their vulnerability, something inside her began to crack. She realized, in that moment, that her anger wasn't just about Sarah's secrets or her father's absence. It was about the realization that, for so long, she had believed she had to carry the burden of their mistakes on her own. She turned to her father, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've hated you for what you did. I've hated that you left us when we needed you. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm not angry at Mom either. I'm just sad. I'm so sad that you weren't here. And I'm sad that Mom had to carry everything alone." She paused, swallowing back the tears. "But maybe I'm angry at myself too. Angry that I couldn't see how much she was hurting. How much we were hurting. I thought you had just abandoned us. But now, I see that we all abandoned each other in different ways." Jessica's voice cracked as she said the words, and the weight of them was heavier than anything she had ever felt before. For so long, she had kept her anger close, using it as a shield against the pain of being abandoned. But now, in the presence of her father, her brother, and the truth they were all facing, that anger melted away. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was a beginning. A beginning of healing that started with understanding, not just blaming. David, watching his sister break down, felt the last of his walls crumble. He had spent years thinking he had been abandoned, thinking he was the one who had been overlooked and neglected. But now, as Jessica poured out her heart, David realized something he hadn't before. They had all been broken in different ways. Their family wasn't just the product of Tom's absence or Sarah's secrets. They had been damaged by their own inability to face the truth, to communicate with each other. David stood up, his hands shaking as he stepped toward Jessica. For the first time in years, he reached out to her, pulling her into an embrace. "We're all a mess, Jess. We've all been hurt, but we're still here. We can still fix this together." The moment was raw, tender. In that space between them, the truth they had been avoiding for so long began to make itself known. They weren't just fighting the ghosts of their parents' mistakes. They were fighting their own guilt, their own inability to connect. But now, as they stood together, something shifted. The healing had begun. Tom, standing off to the side, watching his children embrace, finally made his decision. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect. But he knew that if he didn't step up now, if he didn't face the truth of his own failures, then he might lose them for good. Slowly, cautiously, he walked over to them, his voice low but steady. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything. I've run from this family, I've run from you too, for too long. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm here now, and I'll be here for whatever comes next." For a moment, no one spoke, but the words, simple as they were, broke the last of the tension in the room. Tom had finally made the choice to face the past, to face his children. And for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. The family stood there together, not as the broken pieces they had been moments before, but as something new, something fragile but real. They weren't going to fix everything overnight, but they were beginning, finally, to forgive. And that was the first step toward healing. In the quiet that followed, as the weight of their shared pain settled into something more manageable, the family knew the journey ahead would be hard. There would be setbacks, and old wounds would flare up again. But for the first time, they felt like they could face it together. And that was something they had never known before. In the days that followed the storm of emotions, the family began to settle into a new rhythm. There was no immediate calm, no instant fix to the years of pain and confusion, but there was a shift, a subtle change that could not be ignored. The tension that had once hung in the air like an unspoken accusation was now replaced by something different, the beginning of understanding. The first step in their healing came when they gathered together in Sarah's old living room. It was quiet now, the weight of the recent revelations still lingering but no longer unbearable. Each of them had spent time alone, processing what they had learned, reflecting on the life Sarah had led and the choices she had made. No one could say it was easy, but they had come to realize that Sarah had always acted out of love, even when her actions seemed incomprehensible. Tom, for the first time in a long time, found himself sitting at the kitchen table with his children. His presence was no longer the shadow of a man who had walked away, but a father, finally returning to the space he had abandoned. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured, filled with a tenderness that had been absent for years. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about Sarah," he said quietly, his eyes lingering on the family photo on the wall, one from years ago, before everything had started to unravel. "And I've come to understand something that's hard to admit. She didn't keep those secrets to hurt us. She kept them because she thought it was the best way to protect us. She never wanted to see us suffer the way she had, the way she felt in her own heart. Jessica, sitting across from him, nodded slowly. She had always felt so much anger, so much resentment toward both her parents. But now, hearing her father speak like this, a new understanding began to take shape inside her. The mother she had once seen as a perfect figure was just as flawed and human as anyone else. But Sarah had made the hardest choice, choosing to protect her family from the truth that could have torn them apart. And Jessica began to see the sacrifices her mother had made in a different light. "I've been so angry at her," Jessica admitted, her voice shaky. "I hated her for keeping things from me. I hated her for making me feel like I had to hold everything together alone. But now I understand. She wasn't hiding from me. She was hiding from me." Her voice cracked, and for the first time in a long time, tears flowed freely. "I can't keep carrying all this anger. She loved us. She loved us in a way that maybe we didn't even realize." David, sitting on the other side of the table, had been listening intently. As the quiet settled in around him, he felt something deep within him shift. The years of resentment, of feeling like the outsider, like the one who was always left in the background, seemed to dissolve in the wake of his family's new understanding. The letter Sarah had written to him, about her sacrifices and the ways she had tried to protect him, had opened his eyes in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Turning to his father, David spoke, his voice low but steady. "I never got it, Dad. I never understood why we couldn't be a normal family. But now I see it wasn't just about you being absent. It was about Mom, too. She was trying to shield us from her own battles. We never gave her the chance to tell us what she was going through." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. I guess I finally understand why she kept so much inside. It wasn't about us not being enough. It was about her trying to protect us from a world she knew would break us." The words hung in the air, each of them feeling the weight of what had been said. It was a moment of realization, a moment when they all understood that Sarah's secrets weren't just her burden to bear. They were the burden of a family that had been unknowingly carrying them for years. Tom looked at his children, his heart heavy with the understanding of just how much they had all suffered, and how little he had been there to help. He knew that nothing could erase the pain they had all endured, but in this moment, there was something new, a chance to rebuild what had been lost. The room was quiet for a moment as each family member sat with their thoughts, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. What they had learned was hard to swallow, but it was necessary. The truth had a way of revealing itself, whether they were ready for it or not. And now, the family had to find a way to move forward, not as the fractured group they had been, but as something new, something stronger. As the days passed, the family began to make small changes. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about learning to live with it. They took walks together, something they had stopped doing years ago. They had quiet dinners without the anger that used to sit between them like a third person at the table. The process wasn't easy, but they were learning how to forgive. Not just Sarah, but each other. Jessica and Tom began to speak more openly, their conversations less about blame and more about understanding. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension, but for the first time, they were communicating in ways they hadn't in years. David, too, found a new sense of belonging within the family. He started to spend more time with his sister and father, even though it still felt awkward at times. But he knew that, like Jessica, he had to let go of the past if he was ever going to move forward. He couldn't change the things that had hurt him, but he could choose how to carry them from this point on. And as the weeks went by, Sarah's presence remained in their lives, not as a shadow of guilt or unspoken resentment, but as a quiet memory of the mother who had done the best she could. The family found themselves in a new place, no longer defined by the lies or the things left unsaid, but by the love that had always been there, buried beneath the surface. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the family spoke about Sarah, about who she had been and who she had become. They laughed at the silly things she used to say, and they cried for the things they never got to say to her. But through it all, they understood that the love she had given them was never conditional. It wasn't based on perfect decisions or flawless actions. It was based on the simple truth that she had always done her best, even when the choices were the hardest. In that moment, they understood the power of forgiveness, not just for Sarah, but for themselves. They had finally started to let go of the past, to face their own flaws, and to accept that sometimes, love meant making the hardest choices of all. And as the family sat there, together at last, they knew that while the past could never be undone, they could still create something new, something real, something stronger than the weight of their old wounds. And that was enough to begin again. The journey we've just witnessed isn't just a story about one family's struggle with secrets, loss, and forgiveness. It's a question that many of us will face at some point. What happens when the past we thought was long buried rises to the surface, demanding to be confronted? When the ones we love are gone, and we find ourselves standing in the rubble of their choices. What do we do with the truth we discover? What would you do if you uncovered a hidden part of your family's past after someone you loved passed away? Would you seek the truth, risking the pain and upheaval it might cause? Or would you turn away, leaving the secrets where they are, hoping they stay buried? Take a moment and think about it. How would you react if you suddenly learned things about your loved ones that you never expected? Things that could change everything you thought you knew about them. What if that truth was so powerful, so difficult to understand, that it could either tear your family apart or bring it closer together? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. How would you handle a revelation like this? What do you think is the right choice when the past comes knocking? Would you dig deeper or let it remain in the shadows? We want to hear from you, and we value your perspective. If you found this story moving, if it made you reflect on your own family, your own past, then make sure to subscribe to our channel for more. Every week, we bring you more powerful, emotional stories, ones that'll make you question the nature of love, forgiveness, and the choices that shape our lives. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching Soulful Twists. We hope you found this story as meaningful as we did. Remember, sometimes the hardest paths lead us to the most unexpected places. And who knows, perhaps the next twist will change everything once again. See you next time.